My presentation today is titled Beyond Golden Books, The Art of Gustaf Tenggren. When I mention that I'm doing a lecture on Gustaf Tenggren to family and friends, the first response is often, "Who is that?" He is not the most remembered name in children's literature in the art world, but when I mention his work, everybody always suddenly nods in understanding. If you've read The Poky Little Puppy or The Saggy Baggy Elephant, or seen the Disney classics Snow White, Fantasia, and Pinocchio, you know the work of Gustaf Tenggren. Though Poky Little Puppy is by far his most well-known work, his artistic ability and impact go far beyond the notable little dog that remains in print even 75 years after his first appearance. A Swedish-born illustrator who settled in the United States, Gustaf Tenggren's work spanned decades, and his ability to nearly seamlessly transition into new styles and genres over his life gave his career unbelievable staying power that kept him in demand for over 40 years. From his early work inspired by Golden Age illustrators, his commercial art, his work in the animation field with Disney, to his 20 years illustrating for Golden Books, Tangren was able to craft a career in art that still impacts people today. Born in 1896, Gustaf Tenggren was the second youngest of 7 children born to Aaron Tangren, born Aaron Tang, and his wife Augusta in Magra, Sweden. He moved with his family to Örgryte near Gothenburg in 1898. When Gustaf was 4, his father abandoned the family and moved to Boston in the United States. From then on, he was raised by his mother while also spending part of his childhood with his grandparents in Magra. At age 13, while working as a lithographer's apprentice, he was accepted at the Sloyd Franingan School of Arts and Crafts. Due to his family's poverty, his art education was funded by scholarships, and he also maintained his work at the lithographer's shop during the day while attending classes at night. His fellow students noted that while he was poor, he was among the most talented, and he was later accepted at the Valen School of Painting. Tenggren's first personal exhibition was held in a Swedish bookstore in Gothenburg in 1916. In the same year, he began drawing for a local magazine called Vidi, and he served a brief stint in the military after being drafted into a non-combat position in 1917. In 1917, he also began illustrating for a popular Swedish Christmas annual, Bland Tomtar och Troll, Among Gnomes and Trolls, which featured folk and fairy tales, and he would continue his work on this for nearly a decade, even after moving to the United States. Artist John Bauer, who was killed in a shipwreck in 1918 at age 36 with his wife and son, had illustrated some of the previous editions, and Tenggren's initial forays into illustrating the volume were marred by his death, which caused some to unfavorably compare the two. His art from these works may have been influenced by Bauer, whose work on the volume can be seen on the left, as well as other well-known illustrators of the era, including Arthur Rackham and illustrators such as Eric Werenskjold and Theodore Kittelsen, who are known for their folk art, including trolls, and an example of which is visible on the right. In 1919, he moved to Copenhagen, Denmark with his new wife, Anna Petersen, before moving to the United States in 1920, initially settling in Cleveland, where Tenggren's sisters lived. While in Cleveland, he worked as an artist for a local paper and began working in commercial art. He held his first American exhibition in 1922, and while praised, his early art style and subject matter may have been less understood by Americans. A reviewer from the Cleveland paper states, "The average American, not having a background of folklore peopled by gnomes, witches, goblins, and fierce pirates, would find difficulty in following the imaginative flights of the artist. Yet hardly anyone can resist the grotesque and fantastic appeal of these strange pictures. As illustrations for certain stories, some of them would prove highly effective. As abstract pictures, most of his subjects are too foreign for American taste." In 1922 or 1923, Tenggren moved to New York, where he continued with his commercial art, illustrating for magazines such as Life and Cosmopolitan, creating advertisements, and beginning to work in American children's book illustrations again. Joanne Conrad, in her article Fantasy Imaginaries and Landscapes of Desire, Gustaf Tenggren's Forgotten Decades, argues that, though often ignored in analyses of Tenggren's work, his work in commercial art and advertising was some of his most important and helped shape his later career. One of his most well-known advertising campaigns was his creation of the Blue Moon Stockings Girl, which is on the left, and the other ad on the screen was for a silver company, which has some of my favorite ad copy of all time. "Time and tides are kindly to comely Captain Housewife." In 1926, he created art for a themed pirate calendar produced by the newspaper The World, from which newspaper copy touted him as the next great painter of pirates after the late Howard Pyle. One article on the art was headlined, "Youth Rivals Pyle in Pirates Pictures," which led me to believe the editor was very proud of his use of alliteration. This pirate image on the screen wasn't one created for the calendar, but nevertheless, you can be the judge on his status in the great countdown list of pirate painters. He illustrated several books in the 1920s, including an edition of Heidi, Wonder Book and Tanglewood Tales, The Red Fairy Book, and The Ring of the Nibelung in 1932. His work for all of these is quite beautiful and a good example of his early style of art, which seems most informed by the Golden Age. However, his black and white pen illustrations for The Ring of the Nibelung, seen here, while detailed and stunning, even in 1932, are beginning to seem like a bit of a throwback. During this period, he gained quite a bit of success with his work as an illustrator, commercial art, and for occasional portraits. In the decade before he was hired by Disney in 1936, he was earning an average of $8,500 a year at a time when the average U.S. salary was around $1,500. Like many artists in history, Gustaf Tenggren also had his flaws. He seemed to be particularly drawn to the popular weaknesses of liquor, parties, and women. In a recent Swedish biography by Lars Emanuelsson and Oscar Ekman contains several anecdotes of his indiscretions, including a claim that he may have fathered a child with a young woman in Sweden named Anna Stenborg, mere months before his engagement to his first wife. The child was adopted, but unfortunately died young of tuberculosis. While in the United States, the fraught nature of his relationship with his wife Anna became apparent. He drank, cheated, and apparently even pulled a knife on her at one point. He also began openly courting Malin or Molly Frober, while still married to Anna, causing the two women to confront him together to make up his mind. Anna eventually moved back to Cleveland in the mid-1920s. Rather than divorce Anna in the United States, where a long court battle would probably ensue, he traveled to Mexico, whether with Anna or alone is unclear, though my personal assumption is he probably went alone, to obtain a quickie divorce, which allowed him to marry Molly in September 1927 in Jersey City. The divorce was not considered valid in Sweden, and probably even parts of the United States, and 20 years later, Anna would be forced to go through a drawn-out period in the Swedish courts in order to have her marriage to Gustaf formally dissolved so she could remarry in Sweden. In 1932, well-known gossip columnist Walter Winchell referred to him as a playboy painter, and another column from 1930, ostensibly on Greenwich Village, wrote, "Gustaf Tenggren is one of America's finest color artists. Eric Zorn has said he is the most gifted artist in the world today. A young man in his early 30s, he has traveled to the four corners of the world, the South Seas, the Capes, Greenland, Alaska, Africa. He has seen and painted them all." Tangren, who incidentally painted the famous Half Moon Stockings girl without signing his name, has great wealth and influence. He owns a palatial lodge in the Adirondacks, homes in New York, and his yachts are anchored along the eastern seaboard. Yet this talented painter, who has access to the companionship of the greatest minds in American culture, prefers to sit at night in Italian wine dive on McDougal Street, talking lazily with a group of cheap ne'er-do-wells, phonies who will listen to as long as the wine holds out. This is the lure of Greenwich Village. While much of what they wrote doesn't appear to be true, the article practically characterizes him as a young Rockefeller, it shows that at the very least he apparently had a reputation around town. In 1936, Tenggren's reputation as an artist had grown enough that he was hired in 1936 as an art director for Walt Disney, while the company was in the midst of creating its groundbreaking film, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. After their abrupt move to Los Angeles from New York, Molly wrote back home in a letter, "The city here is beautiful and clean, no dust and dirt. It hardly seems possible after New York and the Middle West. This is the first time since coming to America that Gustaf feels at home and happy." Tangren was not an animator, but rather a concept artist, meaning that he painted the scenes that were used as a starting point for other artists to create the animation from. Since he came into Snow White while the film was already underway, much of the visual design and tone of the film had already been set, but some sources give Tangren credit for the designs of some of the forest backgrounds and the dwarf's cottage. Additionally, he created much of the art that was used for promotional materials, including posters seen here. The film for which Tangren's design fingerprint is most visible is Pinocchio, which he did most of the conceptual design for. The visual setting was changed from Italy to Germany, and Disney animator Frank Thomas says he was, quote, completely responsible for the appearance of the picture, down to the little Tyrolean costumes the characters wore. Tangren created elaborate bird's-eye views of the cityscapes that the camera would move through seamlessly. His complex and meticulous style was difficult for animators to reproduce and often expensive. The 40-second scene with the camera panning through the studio to Pinocchio first emerging from Geppetto's front door cost $48,000. Though we do not have any original Pinocchio art in the Tangren collection, since those were done under contract with Disney, The colorful watercolors you see on the slides are actually original concept art by Tangren that is currently on display as part of the Guillermo del Toro exhibit at the Minneapolis Institute of Art through May 28th, which I encourage you to go check out. In addition to his work on feature-length projects, Tangren also worked on shorts, including The Old Mill, which, if you're interested, is available in its entirety on YouTube. The Old Mill is filled with lush nature imagery, as well as the careful attention to detail and architecture that is often displayed in the cottage of Snow White and the detailed townscapes of the European village in Pinocchio. His original concept art is on the left on the slide, with stills from the finished animation on the right. He was also involved in the creation of The Sorcerer's Apprentice segment of Fantasia, as well as some of the early work on Bambi, including a research trip to Yosemite while Pinocchio was still in production, apparently to the chagrin of others, who, as he was told, he needed to finish Pinocchio first. Of his work on Bambi, Tangren was quoted in a paper of the time stating, quote, "I had to work out the camera angles, of course. That is very complicated. The camera is the bird's eye. It wheels, hovers over the foliage, given the impression of the total wilderness, then sinks down through. It comes closer to earth, passes big branches, all the crisscrossed obstructions down to the forest floor, the deadfalls, and there, at the heart of things, the branches draw back. These again are camera tricks, and now we focus on that little corner of a thicket where the newborn Bambi lies close against his mother's flank. It took weeks of preliminary forest studies, I can tell you, to get down to that small thicket that bring into view those first scenes where Bambi gets up on his tottering legs and takes his first steps." However, despite his apparent passion for the project, the vision for Bambi was eventually taken over by a young Chinese-American artist named Tyrus Wong, who died just last December, and whose concept art is visible on the right, contrasted with Tangren's. He had a very different style from Tangren, replacing Tangren's time-consuming detail with impressionistic pastels and brushstrokes. In 1939, Tangren left Disney at the end of his 3-year contract and spent some time in Mexico partying and rubbing elbows with people like Diego Rivera. And in 1940, he moved to Florida and spent a short period at another animation studio, Fleischer Studios, which was known for characters such as Popeye and Betty Boop. But the company was in the midst of financial difficulties, and the company folded in 1942. One of the first books Tangren published after his work at Disney was a Mother Goose collection in 1940. Even here you can see the transformation of style his work has undergone since the earlier 1930s. The impact of Disney can be seen in his style. Peter Pumpkin Eater bears a striking resemblance to this Snow White dwarfs right down to his shoes, as well as an abrupt change of medium with his move from watercolor to tempera paints, which gave his material a brighter and more opaque look while also being fast-drying and more efficient than watercolor. During this period, he began illustrating more frequently with new titles, including the New Illustrated Book of Favorite Hymns and The Story of England, visible here. The Tell It Again book, another example where the influence of Disney becomes visual. Additionally, his use of vertical and horizontal lines in the illustrations for this work are quite striking. Stories from the Great Metropolitan Operas, which, as it sounds like, was illustrated versions of famous operas, and The Little Match Girl. Though the publisher ultimately decided to change the ending of this Hans Christian Andersen work to a happy ending where the child finds a family, Tangren's original dummy, seen on the right for the title, shows his sketches for the original darker ending where she dies frozen in the snow. In 1942, Tangren was hired as an artist for a new series called Little Golden Books, a project by Western Publishing as a way to create an inexpensive series of books for children that would cost 25 cents apiece. His first work for the line was one of their inaugural 12 titles and is still in print, The Poky Little Puppy. His Golden Book contract shows the clout he had as an artist, while many of the books published under the series were strictly contract work where the creator received a set fee, including the author of Poky Little Puppy, Jeanette Sebring Lowry. Tangren received royalties and was able to negotiate more favorable contracts. The startling success of Poky apparently took Tangren by surprise, as evidenced by his inscription to Dr. Curlin on the inside copy of the book that we have here at the collection. Dr. Irvin Curlin, this has been the bestseller. Just why, I don't know. After 1944, nearly all of Tangren's children's books were published as Little Golden Books or one of their larger, more expensive, and more complex offshoots, such as Big Golden Books and Giant Golden Books. Joanne Conrad notes of his changed style during this period. Often described as a complete break from his earlier styles, Tangren's post-Disney return to children's book illustration and fairy tale themes in the Little Golden Books can more productively be seen as an extension of his work in illustration, advertising, and animation in the 20s and 30s. His His colorful, constructivist-inspired illustrations completed the radical new vision of Little Golden Books to produce cheap, image-heavy children's books hitherto unimagined volume, and arguably his illustrations contributed to the series' unprecedented success. Over his long career, Tangren would continuously renegotiate form and context, working in emerging commercial media to incorporate new forms and techniques while reshaping images from previous contexts to create new sensibilities. Some of his most well-known works from this period include The Big Brown Bear, The Tawny Scrawny Lion, The Saggy Baggy Elephant, and The Shy Little Kitten. Through the line of big golden books and giant golden books, we see Tangren indulge in more in-depth and extensive illustration. Many of these works even had his name attached to the title, showing his name itself was a selling point. These works include titles such as Cowboys and Indians, The Night Before Christmas, Tangren's Storybook with tales such as Robin Hood, Gulliver's Travels, and Rip Van Winkle, and Pirates, Ships, and Sailors, which are some of my favorites. In the 1950s, we can see Tangren returning what could be considered his roots, fairy tale illustration. During this decade, numerous titles from fairy and folk tales were published by Golden Books with Tangren illustrations. Thumbelina, seen here, showing some of his process work on the right, where you can see the transformation of the style of Thumbelina to sort of a more Disney-esque Sleeping Beauty style. Jack and the Beanstalk, The Golden Goose, Snow White and Rose Red, and The Giant with the 3 Golden Hairs. After 1955, his illustration work begins to slow down. While he created many successful works for Golden Books, he may have been one of their more difficult artists to negotiate and work with. In a letter from his editor to the head of Golden Books, his editor quipped, "He doesn't come under the heading of one of our easiest people to handle." Despite this, during his last years illustrating for Golden Books, he created some of his most beautiful creations, including Tangren's Golden Tales from the Arabian Nights, and Canterbury Tales, where his dramatic illustrations even includes examples of his skill with calligraphy with his imitation of medieval illuminated manuscripts seen on the top left. The last book he published with them in 1962 was King Arthur and His Knights of the Round Table, which in my opinion is one of his most masterful works, packed with colorful, detailed, and beautiful depictions of English legend. Going through his papers here at the archives, you discover many of his unpublished masterpieces that likely would have been in line with the beauty and skill of his Arabian Nights and King Arthur. We have sketches and layout notes for an adaptation of Fouquet's romance Undine about a water fairy who marries a knight to gain a soul, as well as Golden Treasury of Myths and Legends, which we even have some completed illustrations for. With this title, you can see, though the treasury wasn't published, his giant illustration in the top right was later used for the standalone story of the giant with the 3 golden hairs. One of my favorites of the unpublished works is Weird and Fantastic Tales, which was to be a compilation of classic ghost stories and monster tales by authors such as Edgar Allan Poe. His sketches remain eerie and beautiful, and the few finished pieces we have a bit of the eccentric air of Tim Burton about them. This one appears to have been the closest to being published, though the project was eventually shelved by Golden Books, with Tangren noting in a letter to his editor, "It doesn't surprise me that it was decided to shelve ghost stories. Not at any time during the past year was there any real coherence or interest shown in getting the book going. I am relieved to have it over with." The unpublished work we have the most finished art for is Tangren's Fairy Book, a compilation of classic fairy tales and related stories. This set of stories seems to be where all of his artistic veins, classic illustration, commercial art, Disney animation, really seem to join together flawlessly. The stories were all chosen, the tempera art nearly completed, but sadly it was never published. After King Arthur was published in 1962, he mostly ceased work on children's book, though in 1956 he was contracted to create the cover, illustrating a piece on Walt Disney for the Saturday Evening Post, showing that his reputation surrounding the early years of Disney continued on, even though he had only spent 3 years there nearly 2 decades prior. Tangren's wife, Molly, handled most of the business side of Tangren's work and also trained as a nurse, took care of him in his later years, which were spent at their home in remote Dogs Head, Maine, where he and Molly had settled in 1944, purchasing a large old estate of Swedish antiques to furnish their home. The image on the left is a self-portrait Tangren painted shortly after they moved in 1945, in which they look rather cold and less than enthusiastic. But the snapshot on the right from a few years later shows a little more enthusiasm, shows him with his golden shepherd Beowulf. Tangren eventually died of lung cancer in 1970 at age 73. Though many do not know his name, they should, as his work lives on besides greats like Dr. Seuss and Clement Hurd. With many of his titles still in print and his films with Disney still popular, he continues to shape the lives of children. However, even beyond the work that remains readily available to modern consumers, his works through the years show an artistic sophistication and power that deserve to be revisited today.